Justice Delayed, The Ethan Brooks Story, Part 1, The Arrest. What happens when the man you wrongfully arrest isn't just another face in the crowd, but the very person who holds your entire future in his hands? When two reckless officers think they can humiliate a black professional on a rainy night, they have no idea they've just started a battle that will shake their entire city to its core. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a system exposed, a reckoning long overdue, and a man who refuses to back down. And believe me, you won't believe how it all ends. Stick around, because once we dive in, there's no turning back. It started like any other night. The streets of downtown Savannah shimmered under the slick sheen of a summer storm. The rain had come down hard earlier, pounding the sidewalks, flooding the gutters, and washing the dusty heat from the air. Now it was a slow, misting drizzle, just enough to blur the neon lights and make the world feel hazy, dreamlike, or maybe like a warning. Ethan Brooks didn't notice the warning signs. He walked with steady purpose, his polished dress shoes tapping sharp beats on the wet pavement, the shoulders of his gray tailored suit dusted with raindrops. In his left hand, he carried a slim leather briefcase, and in his right, he held a phone pressed against his ear. His voice was low and clipped, discussing last-minute details about tomorrow's press conference. "We need to emphasize accountability in the opening statement," Ethan said into the phone, sidestepping a growing puddle. "The public needs to hear that word first and foremost. Accountability." The word itself felt solid on his tongue, a cornerstone of everything he'd built his career upon. The raindrops tapped a gentle rhythm on his umbrella, creating a cocoon of white noise that isolated him from the city sounds. For 20 years, he'd worked his way up from public defender to prosecutor to ethics committee chair, all building toward tomorrow. The culmination of a lifetime's work, the validation of every sacrifice. It was supposed to be a good night, a milestone. Tomorrow, the whole state would know Ethan Brooks, the boy from the West Side who had outworked and outlasted every obstacle, was now the newly appointed director of public integrity, the watchdog over every law enforcement agency in Georgia. But for now, it was just another walk through a city he thought he understood. The rumble of an engine behind him barely registered at first, another car moving through the wet streets, nothing unusual. But then the headlights grew brighter, closer, slower. A sharp squeal as the tires bumped up against the curb caught his attention. He glanced back, frowning slightly. A black and white patrol car had rolled up behind him, its headlights cutting through the mist like two angry eyes. For a second, he thought maybe they were responding to something else. Maybe he should just move along, keep walking. He was almost at his building. Then the spotlight hit him, bright, accusing. A crackle from the loudspeaker cut through the rainy silence. "You in the suit, stop right there." "Hands where we can see them." Ethan froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. His mind raced. Was there someone behind him, some confusion? He turned slowly, lifting one hand slightly in a calming gesture while keeping the phone in the other. "Officers," he started, his voice calm but firm. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "Drop the phone," another voice barked, harsher this time. "Now." Ethan lowered the phone, powering it off with a deliberate click before slipping it carefully into his pocket. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, to stay non-threatening, to make no sudden moves. 20 years as a black man in America had taught him the choreography of survival, slow movements, respectful tone, no sudden gestures that might be misinterpreted as aggression. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser. One was older, stockier, his face carved with lines that looked more like sneers than smiles. Officer Mallory, the name tag read through the way he carried himself, suggested he thought his authority extended far beyond his badge. The other was younger, tall and lanky, his body language uncertain. Benson, according to his uniform, fresh-faced, maybe 2 or 3 years out of the academy, still finding his footing. The older cop took the lead, marching forward with heavy, aggressive steps. "ID," he demanded, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered gun. Now, Ethan didn't argue. Slowly, he reached for his wallet, moving like he was underwater. Deliberate and careful, he held it out, but the officer didn't take it right away. Instead, he looked Ethan up and down, suspicion burning in his eyes. "What are you doing out here dressed like that?" the cop asked, voice dripping with distrust. Ethan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Instead, he answered evenly, walking home from a late meeting. I live 2 blocks from here." The younger officer shifted uneasily, glancing at his partner as if uncertain whether this was the kind of situation he'd been trained for or the kind he had been warned about. There was something in Benson's eyes, not quite disagreement, but discomfort. Like he was watching a script unfold that he knew wasn't right but didn't have the courage to rewrite. The older cop grunted. "You fit the description." "What description?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but edged now. The officer's lips curled in a smirk. Black male in a suit acting suspicious. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to keep breathing, to stay composed. He'd worked too hard for too long to let anger get the better of him here. Anger was a luxury black men couldn't afford when facing authority, especially men with badges and guns who'd already decided what they were seeing. "I'm just trying to get home, officers," Ethan said. "If you'd like to verify my ID, you'll see." "Open the briefcase," the older cop interrupted, stepping closer, the muscles in his jaw tight. "It's work documents," Ethan said, holding the briefcase a little tighter. "Open it now," the cop repeated, his hand moving to his belt, fingers brushing the taser. A small crowd was starting to form across the street. People exiting restaurants, rideshare drivers, waiting for passengers. Phones came up, faces half curious, half concerned. Ethan knew exactly how this looked. And he knew exactly how fast things could spiral. Very slowly, he bent down and placed the briefcase on the ground, rain pooling around the leather edges, seeping toward the corners. He could feel the weight of all those eyes watching, recording. Each keystroke of a text message, each camera lens capturing his humiliation. "Sir, with all respect," he said, his voice low, steady. "I haven't broken any law. I've done nothing wrong." The older cop didn't answer. Instead, he reached out roughly, grabbing Ethan's arm and spinning him around. "Hands behind your back," he barked. The younger officer hesitated, almost stepping forward, but then froze. His hand hovered at his side like he was glued in place. A statue depicting the consequences of silence. "You're making a mistake," Ethan said, feeling the cold bite of the cuffs snapping around his wrists. The older cop leaned in close enough that Ethan could smell the coffee on his breath. "The mistake," he hissed, "was thinking you could walk around here and not draw attention." The younger cop flinched. The onlookers gasped. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything." But the older cop ignored them, shoving Ethan forward toward the cruiser, his dress shoes sliding awkwardly against the slick sidewalk as they stuffed him into the back seat. Rain dripped from the brim of his suit, pooling on the cracked leather upholstery. Ethan sat there, the weight of the cuffs digging into his wrists, the smell of wet vinyl filling his nose, the hum of humiliation pounding in his ears. Somewhere deep inside, anger smoldered. Not fear, not shame, anger, because they didn't know who he was. And when they found out, it wasn't just going to change their night, it was going to change everything. The cruiser jolted as it pulled away from the curb, tires splashing through puddles, sending ripples of dirty rainwater up onto the sidewalk. Ethan sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists aching against the cuffs, the leather seats sticking cold and wet to the back of his suit jacket. He stared straight ahead, his reflection distorted in the rain-streaked window, fractured by the bars between the seats. Every breath he took felt heavier, like the humid air itself was pressing down on him, thick with injustice. Up front, the older officer, Mallory, grumbled under his breath about people like him never learning. The younger cop, Benson, said nothing. His hands fidgeted on his lap, tapping out an uneven rhythm against the dashboard, betraying the nerves he was trying to hide. Ethan stayed silent, knowing better than to provoke, knowing it wouldn't matter what he said anyway. In their eyes, he was already guilty of something. The only question was how far they were willing to take it. The cruiser made a hard turn, throwing Ethan against the door. He braced himself awkwardly, the cuffs biting deeper into his skin. They weren't heading toward the nearest precinct. No, they were taking the long way. The empty street stretched ahead of them, lined with shuttered shops and darkened windows. Isolation, less witnesses. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew the tactics, he knew the game. He had spent years studying abuses of power, years preparing to hold systems like this accountable, and now here he was, living proof that even being prepared wasn't always enough. The cruiser slowed again, pulling into a dimly lit alley behind a closed grocery store. The car idled there, engine rumbling like a restless beast. Mallory turned around in his seat, his face shadowed, the blue glow of the dash controls making his features look even harsher. "You know why we stopped you?" he asked, voice dripping with false courtesy. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "No, officer, I don't." Mallory chuckled, low and humorless. "You fit the profile." Black male, late 30s to 50s, alone at night, acting suspicious. Real simple. "I was walking home from work," Ethan said evenly. "That's not suspicious. That's life." Mallory's smile twisted. Smart mouth. Typical. Benson shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening into fists against his thighs. For a moment, Ethan thought the younger man might say something, anything, but he just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Mallory leaned in a little closer. "What's in the briefcase?" "Work files," Ethan replied calmly. "Drugs?" Mallory asked, a mocking edge to his voice. "Guns? Stolen goods?" "No," Ethan said. "Documents, that's all." Mallory nodded slowly as if pretending to believe him, then jerked his thumb toward Benson. "Get it!" Benson hesitated, just a heartbeat, then sighed and climbed out of the car. Ethan watched in the side mirror as Benson retrieved the briefcase from where it had been tossed into the front seat. He popped the latches open clumsily, rifling through neatly organized folders, printouts, and a thin silver laptop. Through the misted window, Ethan could see Benson pausing over a document. His posture changed, stiffening as he read. A flicker of genuine concern crossed his face, the first crack in the facade. After a moment, Benson looked back at Mallory. "It's just papers. Business stuff. Nothing illegal," Mallory snorted. "Yeah, well, you never know." "These people are slick. These people." The words hit Ethan like a slap. Sharp and demeaning, not even trying to hide the racism anymore, just out in the open, as casual as breathing. He felt the anger rise again, hot and immediate. But he forced it back down, locking it away. There would be a time for anger, but not here, not now. Mallory slammed the cruiser into gear and peeled out of the alley, heading back toward the precinct this time. As they drove, he kept glancing at Ethan in the rearview mirror like he was daring him to say something, daring him to give them an excuse to escalate. Ethan said nothing. He stared out the window, watching the city slide past in streaks of rain and neon, a world he had spent a lifetime working to improve. Now, a cage is closing around him. When they reached the station, Mallory yanked the cruiser to a rough stop and got out without a word. Benson followed more slowly, dragging his feet. The door opened with a metallic groan and Mallory barked, "Out!" Ethan stepped carefully onto the wet pavement, his muscles sore and stiff. The cuffs were still biting into his wrists, but he held his head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him slump. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the chipped tile floors and stained walls. The air smelled of mildew, sweat, and something acrid and metallic like the scent of injustice itself. The booking officer barely glanced up as Mallory pushed Ethan toward the desk. "Name?" he asked in a bored monotone. Mallory answered for him. "Ethan Brooks. No fixed address. Loitering. Resisting lawful commands." Ethan's mouth dropped open in disbelief. "That's not true," he said, voice sharp. Mallory clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You're not helping yourself, Brooks. Maybe you should shut that mouth before you add obstruction to your list." The booking officer smirked and scribbled something down. Benson lingered a few steps behind, his eyes flickering with something almost like regret, but he still said nothing. Fingerprints were taken. Mugshots captured. Personal belongings cataloged, though in Ethan's case, it was just the briefcase and his phone. Through it all, Ethan remained calm. Furious inside, yes, but outwardly composed. He knew better than to show weakness. He had sat across from too many powerful men who thought control meant winning. He knew the truth. Control was a weapon. Mallory shoved him toward a holding cell at the far end of the hallway. The door clanged shut behind him with a sound that echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot. Inside the cell, Ethan sat on the cold metal bench, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The walls were covered in peeling paint, graffiti scratched into every surface, the stale air pressing down on him. He stared at the wall opposite him, willing himself to stay patient. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what was coming. And when they finally realized it, it wouldn't just be them facing consequences, it would be the entire system they thought would protect them. Outside the cell, Mallory and Benson's muffled voices floated through the hall. "He's lucky we didn't charge him with assault," Mallory sneered. Benson's voice, quieter, uncertain. He didn't resist. He didn't do anything. A pause, then Mallory's voice, hard and final. "Doesn't matter, we say he did. End of story." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, grounding himself. Not end of story, not even close. This was just the beginning. Part 2. The Night. The hours stretched on like a slow, grinding machine. Every tick of the station clock, another reminder of just how small they were trying to make him feel. Ethan sat alone on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, his cuffed hands resting in his lap, wrists sore and raw where the steel had dug into his skin. He kept his back straight, his chin lifted, even though every part of him ached to just sink down, to rest, to give in to the exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight, but he wouldn't. Not now. Not here. The sting of the injustice burned hotter than the physical pain. The way Mallory had laughed under his breath while filling out bogus charges. The way Benson had looked away every time their eyes met, pretending he didn't see what was happening. Pretending he didn't know. Ethan knew. He knew exactly what was happening. And deep down, so did Benson. That flicker of hesitation, that nervous energy, Benson knew they were wrong. He just didn't have the spine to stop it. The faint buzz of the station's fluorescent lights filled the empty air, mixing with the occasional distant shout from another cell block, the heavy footsteps of officers walking the halls. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and rang, unanswered. Ethan stared at the peeling gray wall across from him, focusing on his breathing. In, out, steady, controlled. If they thought they could break him with humiliation, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of his breath drown out the rest of it. The smell of mildew and sweat, the sting of the cuffs, the echo of Mallory's sneering voice. They didn't know. They didn't know the kind of storm they were waking up. In the quiet of the cell, Ethan's mind drifted back to another night, 15 years earlier. Fresh out of law school, his first case as a public defender. His client, a 17-year-old boy arrested for matching the description of someone who'd broken into cars downtown. No evidence, no witnesses, just a black teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ethan had won that case, but the victory felt hollow. The damage was already done. The boy had spent 3 nights in jail, missed his final exams, and lost his part-time job. It's not about justice, his supervisor had told him afterward. It's about power. That was the moment Ethan had decided that one day he would be in a position to rebalance the scales. Not just to defend those caught in the system, but to change the system itself. Time passed in a strange, elastic way inside the cell, minutes dragging like hours. Ethan tried not to think about the press conference he was supposed to be preparing for, about the speech he had meticulously written, the leadership team waiting for his final revisions. He wondered if Clara, his assistant, had realized something was wrong yet. She would. She always did. Clara Evans had been with him for 6 years, from his days as a prosecutor to his appointment to the ethics committee. Brilliant, methodical, and fiercely loyal. Once, when a senior official had tried to bury one of Ethan's reports on police misconduct, Clara had accidentally CC'd the entire press corps on their internal discussions. The report made front-page news the next morning. When she found out what had happened, a slow, grim smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. They wouldn't be able to bury this. Not once she got involved. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, snapping him back to the present. Keys rattled. The cell door creaked open. Mallory stood there, arms crossed, a smug smirk plastered across his face. "On your feet," he barked. Ethan rose slowly, refusing to hurry, refusing to show an ounce of fear. The cuffs stayed tight, biting into his skin with every movement. Benson stood a few feet behind Mallory, looking everywhere except at Ethan. "Time to make it official," Mallory said with a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Welcome to the system, Brooks." They led him down a dim hallway toward a small, windowless room with a battered metal desk bolted to the floor. The walls were yellowed from age, the ceiling tiles stained with watermarks. An ancient computer flickered on the desk, its screen displaying a generic intake form. "Sit," Mallory ordered, shoving Ethan down into the rickety chair. The officer behind the desk didn't even look up as he spoke. Confirm your name for the record." "Ethan Brooks," Ethan said, his voice clear and strong. The officer typed it in with 2 fingers, painfully slow. "Charges pending, loitering, resisting arrest, failure to comply," Mallory recited, almost gleefully. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Those are false." Mallory leaned down, bringing his face level with Ethan's, his breath hot and sour. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice low. "All that matters is what's in the report." The man behind the desk gave a tired shrug, like it wasn't his business, like none of it mattered. Just another cog in the machine. Ethan stared straight ahead, refusing to react. They finished processing him without further comment, snapping a grainy intake photo with a clunky old camera mounted in the corner. The flash was blinding for half a second, then gone, leaving Ethan blinking away spots as they marched him back toward the holding cells. The hallway was darker now, the station quieter, the late shift lull. Ethan was shoved back into a different cell, this time smaller, more isolated. No windows, no view of anything except 4 cracked walls and a drain in the center of the floor. Mallory slammed the door behind him, the lock clicking shut with grim finality. "You'll get your hearing tomorrow," he said through the bars, grinning. "Maybe." And then he was gone. The silence was thicker here, heavier. Ethan sat back down on the narrow bench, his mind racing now, not with fear, but with calculation. Tomorrow. Tomorrow was supposed to be the day everything changed. The press conference, the announcement, and his new role were made public. He wondered if anyone at City Hall even knew he was missing yet. They would, sooner or later, someone would notice. And when they did, this wouldn't be just a personnel mistake. It would be a public scandal, a reckoning. For now, though, he was trapped. A black man in a holding cell accused of imaginary crimes just for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or at least that's what Mallory thought. That's what Benson pretended to believe. Ethan flexed his wrists against the cuffs, testing the tightness. The pain was sharp, immediate, but he welcomed it. It reminded him he was still here, still fighting. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fold. He was going to wait. And then he was going to make them regret ever thinking they could treat him like just another statistic. He leaned back against the wall, letting the cold seep into his bones, grounding him. They thought this was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was just the beginning. Part 3, The Reckoning. The hours inside the holding cell blurred together, stretching longer and heavier with every passing minute. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air turning thick with the smell of old concrete and forgotten anger. Ethan sat there in the stillness, feeling the weight of the system pressing down on him, trying to squeeze the fight out of his spirit. But he wasn't built to break. Somewhere outside the cell, voices echoed through the halls, distorted by the metal and stone. Occasionally, heavy boots would stomp past, indifferent, uninterested. To them, he was just another black man in a suit who must have done something wrong. Why else would he be sitting there, cuffed, stripped of his dignity, locked away like a criminal? The thought burned low and deep in his chest. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever sat where he was sitting now. Innocent but presumed guilty, judged before being heard, condemned before being seen. Footsteps approached again, louder this time, stopping just outside his door. The latch clanged, the metal hinges groaning as it swung open. Mallory stood there, arms folded, a smirk carved into his weathered face. "Let's go, Brooks," he said, like he was talking to a stray dog. "Time for some quality bonding time." Ethan stood slowly, every movement controlled, deliberate. He stepped out of the cell without a word, refusing to give Mallory the satisfaction of seeing anything but calm in his eyes. Benson was waiting a few feet down the hallway, hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. Ethan caught the slight downward glance, the way Benson refused to meet his eyes. Good. He should be ashamed. Mallory led the way, pushing open a door at the end of the hallway. It swung inward, revealing a small, grimy interrogation room. Bare walls, a battered table, 2 mismatched chairs, one flickering fluorescent light above, humming like a dying insect. "Sit," Mallory barked. Ethan took his seat, cuffs still digging into his wrists, leaving angry red marks across his skin. Mallory circled him like a wolf sizing up prey. Benson hung back near the door, silent, uneasy. "You know," Mallory said, dropping into the chair opposite Ethan, "you could make this really easy." Ethan lifted an eyebrow slightly, saying nothing. "Tell us what you were really doing out there tonight," Mallory continued. "Tell us what you're hiding." "There's nothing to tell," Ethan said, voice steady. "I was walking home from work. That's it." Mallory leaned back, chuckling darkly. "See, that's the thing. Men like you never just walk home. You're always up to something." The words carried decades of prejudice, generations of assumptions. Behind them stood a wall of history of black bodies stopped, searched, arrested, beaten, all for existing in spaces others decided they didn't belong. Ethan's hands curled into fists where they rested on the table, the metal cuffs rattling softly. He forced himself to breathe, to stay composed. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. Mallory's grin widened. "Don't have to." "I know the type." Benson shifted uncomfortably near the door. Ethan caught it the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. "Good. Let it make him uncomfortable. Let it eat at him." Mallory slapped a manila folder down on the table with a loud thwack. Papers spilled out random printouts, old booking reports, nothing related to Ethan. "We're building a case," Mallory said. "Plenty of priors fitting your description. Wouldn't be hard to connect a few dots. Maybe we will find your prints on something. Maybe a witness remembers seeing you." Ethan stared at him, the disbelief threatening to boil over. They weren't even pretending to follow the law. They were just making it up as they went, confident no one would question them, confident the system would cover for them, like it always had. "You're bluffing," Ethan said finally, his voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. "And you know it." Mallory's smile faltered just for a second, a crack in the armor. Ethan pressed the advantage, leaning forward slightly. "You have nothing," he said. "Because I've done nothing. And every minute you keep me here without cause, you're digging your own grave." Mallory's eyes narrowed dangerously. Across the room, Benson looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Mallory shoved back from the table, the chair screeching against the floor. He stood there for a moment, fists clenched, breathing hard through his nose. "You think you're better than us?" he snarled. "You think wearing a fancy suit and carrying a briefcase makes you untouchable?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "I think following the law makes me untouchable." The room crackled with tension, heavy enough to suffocate. Mallory loomed over him, his shadow stretching across the table. For a long moment, Ethan thought he might lash out at him, drag him down to the floor, and justify it later with some bogus story about resisting. But then Mallory straightened, yanked the door open, and barked at Benson. "Get him out of my sight." Benson hesitated only a second, but enough to notice before stepping forward and gripping Ethan's arm, leading him back out into the hallway. They didn't speak as they walked. The only sounds were the distant buzz of the lights, the shuffle of their shoes on the scuffed tile. Back in the cell, Benson paused before locking the door. For the first time that night, he looked Ethan in the eye. Really looked. There was a flicker there, guilt, shame, maybe even doubt. Good, because soon Benson would have to answer for his silence, just like Mallory would have to answer for his actions. The door clanged shut, locking Ethan inside once again. He sat back down on the bench, cuffs still tight, the ache in his wrists pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow, steady breath. They thought they could bury him. They thought they could humiliate him into silence. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and they were about to find out. Part 4. The Morning After. The morning came with a dull gray light filtering through the narrow barred window above Ethan's cell. It wasn't the kind of sunrise that marked a new day. It was the kind that whispered warnings if you knew how to listen. Ethan sat on the edge of the bench, his wrists stiff from the night in cuffs, his back sore from the unyielding metal, but his mind was sharp, focused. This was the day everything would change. Keys rattled outside the door, the lock thunked open, and Benson appeared, looking like he hadn't slept much either. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes shadowed. "On your feet," he said quietly. Ethan stood, slow and deliberate. No sudden moves, no weakness shown. Mallory was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Ready for your big debut?" He sneered. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. In a few minutes, Mallory's smirk would be the first thing to fall. They walked him through the quiet corridors of the precinct. Officers glanced up from their desks, indifferent, curious, but none stepped forward. To them, he was still nobody. Still, just another case number to process and forget. The van ride to the courthouse was short and silent. Rain streaked the windows again, the city looking washed out, muted. Ethan sat still, hands cuffed in front of him now, his briefcase, the one they'd so eagerly rifled through, secured beside the driver. At least they hadn't lost it. That was going to matter a lot. When they arrived, Benson escorted him into a side entrance, avoiding the main halls where the public and press usually gathered. It was standard for minor offenders. A way to move them in and out without causing a scene. Too bad for them, Ethan thought. A scene was exactly what they were about to get. The courtroom was half full of early risers waiting for hearings, minor arraignments, and procedural rulings. A few attorneys shuffled papers at their tables. A tired judge rubbed his temples behind the bench. To most people in the room, Ethan was just another face among the dozens they'd see that day, until he wasn't. Mallory guided him to the defense table without ceremony. Ethan's court-appointed public defender, a frazzled young woman who looked barely out of law school, whispered a quick hello, her voice rushed and mechanical. She glanced at the intake paperwork, frowning. Loitering, resisting, she muttered. Shouldn't take long. Probably just plead and move on. I'm not pleading guilty to anything, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. She looked up at him properly for the first time, surprised by the steadiness in his tone, the confidence in his posture. All right, she said slowly, flipping through her notes. We'll see what the judge says. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The murmur of conversation died down. Case number 702,631, defendant Ethan Brooks. Ethan stood as Mallory shoved him lightly toward the podium. His hands were still cuffed. They hadn't even bothered to remove them. He kept his head high, his eyes forward. The judge peered down at him over a pair of half-moon glasses. Mr. Brooks, you are charged with loitering, resisting lawful orders, and failure to comply. How do you plead? Before Ethan could open his mouth, the courtroom doors burst open. A woman strode in, heels clicking sharply against the tile, her tailored navy suit impeccable, her expression set like stone. She carried a thick leather folder under one arm. Clara Evans, Ethan's assistant, his ally, and in this moment, his sword. Your Honor, she called, loud enough to cut through the silence, turning every head in the room. I request immediate intervention. The defendant is being unlawfully detained. The judge frowned. And you are? Clara Evans, legal counsel for Mr. Brooks, she said, moving swiftly to the front of the room. And I have proof that this entire arrest is not just unlawful, it's a catastrophic mistake. The judge motioned her forward, irritation flickering across his face. Clara approached, handing over the folder with a practiced snap of her wrist. Inside were Ethan's credentials, his appointment letter, his certifications, his press release set to go public that very morning. The judge flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with every page. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. A few people craned their necks to get a better look. Even some of the officers in the gallery sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. Mallory shifted beside Ethan, his smugness faltering. The judge set the folder down carefully, hands clasped before him. Let me get this straight, he said, his voice dangerously low. You're telling me this man we've booked, cuffed, and dragged into court is Ethan Brooks, the newly appointed Director of Public Integrity for the state of Georgia. Clara nodded once, crisp and professional. Yes, Your Honor. A beat of silence, then the room exploded. Gasps, murmurs, a flurry of movement among the attorneys and spectators. The judge rapped his gavel hard against the bench, calling for order. Mallory's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe underwater. Benson looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Ethan stood there, silent, composed, letting the truth wash over the room like a flood. The judge leaned forward, fixing Mallory with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Officer, he said slowly, deliberately, is there any reason why the arresting documents did not reflect Mr. Brooks's true identity? Mallory stammered. He fit the description. He didn't provide identification, Clara cut in smoothly, which your officers chose to ignore. The judge's gaze hardened further. This is an outrageous violation, he said, voice rising, not only of Mr. Brooks's rights, but of every standard of professionalism we expect from law enforcement. He turned to the bailiff. Uncuff him. Now. The bailiff rushed forward, fumbling with the key, freeing Ethan's wrists. The cuffs clattered onto the table with a hollow ringing sound. Ethan rubbed his wrists slowly, the angry red marks a visible reminder to everyone in the room of what had been done. The judge turned back to him, face now tinged with something that looked almost like regret. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice more measured, "on behalf of this court, I extend my sincerest apologies." Ethan nodded once, accepting but not forgiving. Because apologies weren't enough. Not this time. Not anymore. The judge continued, addressing the courtroom at large now. "This matter is not over," he said sharply. "There will be a full investigation into this arrest and into the conduct of every officer involved." Mallory's hands twitched at his sides. Benson stared at the floor. Ethan met Clara's eyes across the room, and for the first time all night he allowed himself the smallest smile. This wasn't just a personal victory. This was the opening shot in a much bigger war. And Ethan Brooks wasn't just walking free today. He was walking into a fight he intended to win. Part 5. The fallout. The buzz in the courtroom hadn't died down. Even with the judge banging the gavel again and again, trying to bring back order, it was like the walls themselves were humming with tension. People weren't just talking. They were reacting, processing the reality of what had just unfolded right in front of them. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was a catastrophic mistake, a national headline waiting to explode. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. The fabric still wrinkled and stained from the rain and the long night in the holding cell. His wrists bore the raw marks of the handcuffs, bright red and undeniable against his skin. They might as well have been battle scars, proof that no amount of success, no amount of title or power could insulate you from prejudice. The judge cleared his throat hard enough to finally cut through the whispers. "We are not proceeding with these charges," he announced, his voice firm and unyielding. "Mr. Brooks, you are free to leave this courtroom immediately." However, and here his gaze sharpened as it moved to the prosecution table and the officers seated stiffly nearby, this hearing will not be dismissed. He looked down at the folder Clara had delivered, tapping it lightly with 2 fingers. "This court demands answers." There was a long, heavy pause. Every eye turned to the prosecutor, a wiry, gray-suited man named Richard Hayes. His face twitched slightly as he stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, if I may," Hayes began, his voice carefully controlled. The officers involved were acting on a credible report. They had reasonable suspicion to detain the defendant at the time, based on a description provided by witnesses. A few heads in the room nodded slightly. Old habits die hard. But Ethan didn't miss the way Hayes phrased it at the time. Not anymore. Not now that the truth was standing 6 feet tall and furious in front of them. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Reasonable suspicion, counselor," he repeated. "Based solely on the fact that a black man was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase?" Hayes hesitated. There were other factors Clara cut in before he could spin it any further. "Your Honor, permission to speak?" The judge nodded tightly. Clara stepped forward, her voice ringing out, clear and steady. Mr. Brooks fully complied with every command given. He provided identification that clearly showed his identity and his position. The officers chose to ignore it. She turned then, facing the gallery where Mallory sat stiff and silent, his face drained of color. They weren't acting on reasonable suspicion. They were acting on bias. And they treated him not like a citizen, not even like a human being, but like a threat, because of what he looked like. Not because of anything he did. A ripple ran through the courtroom. The truth laid bare needed no embellishment. Hayes shuffled his papers nervously. Regardless, he tried again. The officers believed they were following procedure. Belief does not excuse negligence, the judge snapped, or racial profiling. He leaned forward, fixing Mallory with a stare that could have cut through steel. Officer Mallory stepped forward. Mallory rose, moving stiffly as if his legs no longer wanted to obey him. He stopped a few feet from the bench, hands clenched at his sides. The judge's voice dropped low, the room leaning in to catch every word. "Did you verify Mr. Brooks's identification at the scene?" Mallory's mouth opened, closed. He darted a glance at Hayes, who gave a slight, helpless shrug. "No, Your Honor," Mallory said finally, the words grinding out like stones. "And why not?" Mallory's jaw worked furiously for a second before he muttered, "We thought he was lying." "You thought?" the judge repeated slowly. "Based on what?" His behavior? His refusal to cooperate? Or was it based on the fact that a black man in an expensive suit didn't fit your idea of who belonged on that street? The words landed like hammer blows. Mallory flinched, but said nothing. His silence was louder than any admission. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. "This," he said, gesturing around the courtroom, "is why public trust in law enforcement erodes not because of sensational headlines, not because of outside agitators, because of moments like this." He turned to Clara and Ethan. "You will file an official grievance," he said, his voice brooking no argument, "and I will personally ensure that an internal affairs investigation is launched within the hour." He turned back to Mallory. "As for you, Officer Mallory, consider yourself suspended effective immediately pending the outcome of that investigation." The gasps were louder this time. Even some of the officers in the gallery looked shocked. Mallory stood there, stone-faced, but Ethan could see the panic under the surface, the fear of a man who'd never been held accountable. Until now, the judge wasn't done. "Officer Benson," he said sharply. The younger man jolted like he'd been slapped. "Step forward." Benson moved slowly, his face pale, his movements stiff. The judge's gaze pinned him in place. "You were present for the entire encounter?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You witnessed Mr. Brooks provide his identification?" Benson hesitated for just a breath too long. "Yes, Your Honor. And yet you took no steps to verify it or to intervene when your partner escalated the situation." Benson's mouth opened, but no words came out. The judge nodded grimly. "You will also be subject to investigation. You may remain on administrative duty pending the outcome." Dismissed. Benson sagged slightly, his face crumpling into something close to shame as he backed away. The judge picked up his gavel but didn't strike it yet. He looked back at Ethan, and for the first time there was something different in his eyes. Respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice low but carrying, "this court owes you more than an apology. It owes you action. And I promise you, you will have it." Ethan inclined his head, the gesture small but full of meaning. He wasn't the one who needed saving. He was the one who had come to change the system. The gavel finally came down with a sharp crack. Adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed the steps outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. The story had already begun to spread like a wildfire no one could contain. Inside the courthouse, Ethan paused at the doorway, looking back one last time. Mallory sat slumped at the defense table, abandoned, beaten by his own arrogance. Benson stood near the back, staring down at the floor, the weight of what he'd allowed crashing down on his shoulders. And the judge. The judge watched Ethan go. A man who had seen the system fail right in front of him and had chosen, in that moment, to do something about it. Ethan stepped out into the cold light of day, Clara at his side, the air buzzing with the electricity of change. This wasn't over. This was just the first shot across the bow, and Ethan Brooks was just getting started. Part 6. The storm breaks. The fallout started almost before Ethan even stepped off the courthouse steps. Word spread like a wildfire, faster than any official statement could catch up. The reporters had already pushed the story out across local news channels, blasting headlines online, state official wrongfully arrested. New director of public integrity detained without cause. Savannah PD in crisis after shocking courtroom revelation. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a reckoning. By the time Ethan and Clara reached the car, Ethan's phone, which had been returned to him with a sloppy apology, was already lighting up with missed calls and text messages. Officials from the governor's office, journalists, community leaders, some just wanting a comment, others already offering apologies they hadn't been asked for. Clara drove them away from the courthouse in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the city as it rushed by, his reflection flashing in the windows they passed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The engine noise, the buzzing phone, the low thrum of chaos building outside, that was enough. Savannah was waking up to what had happened, and it wasn't going to go back to sleep anytime soon. By that afternoon, the police department had been forced to issue a statement. They called it a misunderstanding. They called it unfortunate. They promised a full investigation. Words stacked neatly on top of each other, carefully chosen to say absolutely nothing. But it was already too late for damage control. A protest had gathered outside police headquarters within hours. Small at first, just a few dozen people with handmade signs, but it grew fast. Students, community leaders, everyday citizens who had seen the videos recorded outside the courthouse and understood exactly what they were looking at. This wasn't a mistake. This was a mirror. Ethan watched the news footage that night from his living room, sitting on the edge of his couch, still wearing the same rumpled suit. His phone buzzed again. An incoming call from the governor's office. He let it go to voicemail. He needed time to think before stepping into that political minefield. The news anchors didn't shy away. They played the footage of his arrest. The way Mallory had handled him, the way Benson had looked the other way. They replayed the moment in court when Clara had exposed everything again and again, frame by frame. One outlet had even gotten footage of Mallory being led out of the precinct in front of a wall of cameras, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, flanked by internal affairs agents. Savannah PD wasn't just scrambling, they were bleeding. The next morning, headlines went national. Cable news, morning talk shows, viral tweets with millions of views. By lunchtime, the department announced that Officer Mallory had officially been placed on unpaid suspension pending investigation. Officer Benson had been reassigned to desk duty while under review. It wasn't enough, not even close. Ethan could feel it everywhere he went. The shift, the way conversations paused when he entered a room. The way people looked at him now, not just with curiosity, but with expectation. He had become something more than just a man wronged. He had become a symbol, and symbols didn't get the luxury of standing still. That afternoon, Ethan sat across from Clara at a small cafe a few blocks from his office, the first real break he'd had since the arrest. The world outside buzzed with tension. Every passerby seemed to move faster, talk louder. "You can't ignore this," Clara said quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about what happens every day to people who don't have a camera or a courtroom or a lawyer ready to jump in." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already racing ahead. He had spent years preparing to lead, to reform, to push for slow, steady change. But now, the city was demanding something more, not quiet reform, not backdoor meetings, real accountability, real change, and they were looking to him to make it happen. That night, he stood in front of a packed auditorium at a town hall meeting hastily organized by community leaders. The air buzzed with urgency. Hundreds of people filled the seats. Neighbors, teachers, activists, parents, even a few brave officers who hadn't yet abandoned hope that the system could be salvaged. The moderator introduced him simply, Director Ethan Brooks. The applause was loud, sustained, but it wasn't just for him. It was for what he represented, for what people needed him to be. Ethan stepped up to the podium, his hands steady despite the whirlwind of the past 48 hours. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need a speechwriter. He spoke from the storm that had been brewing in his chest for years. "I stand before you tonight, not just as someone who was wronged," he said, his voice carrying easily to the farthest corners of the room. "I stand before you as someone who knows that what happened to me is a reflection of a deeper, uglier truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "A truth that says appearances matter more than actions, that says power can be abused without consequence, that says some people can be presumed guilty without a shred of evidence." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Agreement, pain, recognition. "But that truth," Ethan continued, "is not the one we have to accept." He looked out at the faces staring back at him, young, old, black, white, tired, angry, hopeful. "We can choose to write a new story," he said. "One where transparency isn't a request, it's a requirement. Where accountability isn't a buzzword, it's the standard." The crowd leaned in closer, and it starts now. Thunderous applause erupted. People rising to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even crying. Ethan stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding not from fear but from the magnitude of what lay ahead. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And this time, Ethan Brooks wasn't standing alone. Part 7. The Rising Tide. The days that followed moved faster than anyone could keep up with. One headline wasn't enough. There were dozens, hundreds of interviews, op-eds, and viral posts with millions of views. Ethan's name was everywhere. And not just his name, his face, his story, his fight. It wasn't just Savannah anymore. Atlanta picked it up. Then D.C., then the national morning shows, the wrongfully arrested director of public integrity, the system that tried to silence him and ended up handing him a megaphone. Protests outside the police department swelled from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. They held signs with slogans that cut to the bone. Accountability now. Justice isn't a suit you can take off. Reform or resign. Outside City Hall, TV trucks lined the curbs, cables snaking across the sidewalks, reporters live streaming 247. Inside those buildings, behind those closed doors, you could feel it. The scrambling, the fear. Officials who once dodged Ethan's calls were now begging for meetings. Department heads who once dismissed his reports were now praising his leadership to anyone who would listen. It would have been almost funny if it wasn't so predictable. But Ethan wasn't laughing. He didn't have time. The governor's office issued a public statement of full support, pledging swift reforms and an unwavering commitment to restoring public trust. It sounded good, polished, safe. Ethan knew better than to take words at face value. He needed action, and he wasn't about to ask nicely anymore. He met with Clara late one night in the small, windowless office they'd been given temporarily while city renovations were supposedly underway. A stack of folders covered the table between them. Documents, complaints, policy drafts. Clara leaned back in her chair, exhaustion plain on her face. "They want to offer you a settlement," she said, flipping through one of the folders without really seeing it. "Quiet payout, NDA. No official fault admitted." Ethan didn't even blink. "No." Clara looked up at him, searching his face. "They're scared," she said. "They should be," Ethan replied. Outside the window, sirens wailed in the distance. Not unusual in Savannah, but somehow it felt different now, louder. "Closer." Clara closed the folder gently. "They're counting on you being tired," she said, "on you wanting to go back to your life, back to your plans." Ethan smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "It was the kind you wore into battle. My plans changed," he said simply. The next morning, Ethan stood in front of a packed press conference, cameras flashing, reporters jostling for position. He wore a fresh suit this time, sharp, black, commanding. He didn't bring notes, didn't need them. He knew exactly what he was going to say. "Good morning," he began, voice calm but carrying. "I want to thank the citizens of Savannah and across this country who have stood up in the last few days, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced by a system built to protect itself instead of the people it's supposed to serve." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. This isn't about one arrest, one bad cop, one bad night. He looked straight into the cameras, into the millions of eyes watching. This is about a culture, a pattern, a rot that runs deeper than any single case. He laid it out clearly. A list of demands. Independent review boards with real authority. Body camera footage released within 72 hours of any arrest. Mandatory de-escalation training penalties for racial profiling. Leadership reshuffling at the department level, not ... Requests. Requirements. The room was dead silent except for the scratch of pens and the whir of cameras. And then slowly, someone started clapping. Then another, and another, until the room filled with the sound of applause, not polite, not political, but real, raw. Ethan stood there and took it all in, not for himself, but for what it meant. The tide had turned. Later that night, another crack formed inside the system. Officer Benson. He'd been quiet since the courtroom, lurking in the background, but tonight he spoke. In an interview with a local news station, Benson sat in front of a plain gray backdrop, eyes hollow, voice tight. "I should have said something," he admitted. "I knew it was wrong. I let it happen. I let it happen because I was scared of what it would mean for me." He paused, swallowed hard. But being scared isn't an excuse. Not anymore. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened. Nothing would be, but it mattered. Ethan watched the interview replay on his laptop, arms crossed over his chest, emotions churning. Benson's words wouldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could help change the future. Meanwhile, pressure mounted inside the Savannah Police Department. Anonymous leaks started hitting the press internal emails, reports of previous complaints against Mallory that had mysteriously disappeared from official records, rumors of systemic issues stretching back years. Every day, new voices spoke out. Officers who had stayed silent for too long. Community members who had been brushed aside, dismissed. The blue wall wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. And through it all, Ethan moved forward steady and relentless. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of a deep, burning belief that no one else should have to go through what he did, that no one should be treated like a suspect just for existing, that no one should be silenced because the truth made powerful people uncomfortable. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't just a few isolated voices calling for change. It was an army, and Ethan Brooks was leading the charge. Part 8, the rebuilding. Rebuilding trust wasn't as easy as standing at a podium and delivering a good speech. Ethan knew that. Everyone knew that. Trust wasn't something you asked for. It was something you earned. One choice at a time, one uncomfortable conversation at a time, one change that actually stuck long after the cameras turned off. And right now, Savannah needed a lot more than speeches. The first few days after Ethan's demands went public were a whirlwind of announcements and promises, press releases about new community oversight boards, task forces being formed, policy reviews underway. On paper, it all sounded good, solid, impressive, but on the ground, it was a different story. Inside the police department, resistance simmered just beneath the surface. Officers whispered in break rooms. Anonymous comments flooded local news sites. Anonymous letters circulated claiming Ethan was trying to handcuff law enforcement and make the city unsafe just to score political points. Old loyalties didn't die quietly, and not everyone wanted the system to change. Ethan wasn't surprised. Real change always made the comfortable feel threatened. Still, it didn't make the fight any easier. He spent hours sitting across from department heads parsing through bloated policies that protected bad actors and punished whistleblowers. He met with community leaders late into the night, hammering out the details of the Civilian Review Board, the one that would have actual teeth, real power to investigate misconduct, not just a symbolic panel. A watchdog with a bite. He listened to story after story, some told with anger, others with tears about sons stopped for matching a description, daughters followed through stores, fathers arrested for raising their voices in defense. Each story fueled him. Each story sharpened his resolve. One afternoon, sitting in a cramped meeting room inside City Hall, Ethan outlined the next phase of reforms to a room packed with city council members and senior officers. Mandatory de-escalation training, independent audits of use of force incidents, transparent public reporting, a culture shift, not just better procedures, but better people. The room was stiff, the air tense. You could practically feel the resentment coming off some of the older officers, the ones who thought wearing a badge gave them a free pass to act without consequence. One councilman, an older man with a deep frown line etched across his forehead, spoke up finally. "You're asking us to dismantle everything that's worked for decades," he said, voice tight. "Do you know how dangerous that could be?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm asking you to dismantle what's been protecting the wrong people for decades," he said. "And do you know how dangerous it is if we don't? Silence." No one wanted to say it out loud, but it hung there anyway. Savannah wasn't safe because of the system they had. It was surviving in spite of it, and survival wasn't good enough anymore. After the meeting, Clara caught up with him in the hallway, her tablet clutched against her chest. "You're making progress," she said. Ethan gave a humorless smile. "Feels more like pushing a boulder uphill with one hand tied behind my back." She nodded. "That's what real change feels like." Later that week, the Civilian Oversight Board officially launched. They held their first open forum inside a packed community center. People poured in, neighbors, pastors, teachers, business owners, officers too, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, trying not to be noticed. The board members, carefully selected to represent the city's diversity, sat behind a long table, facing the crowd. Ethan stood off to the side, arms folded, watching. This wasn't about him anymore. It was bigger now. A young woman stepped up to the microphone first. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She told the story of her younger brother, arrested at 16 for looking suspicious while walking home from a tutoring session. The charges had been dropped, but the damage had been done. They told him he should have known better, she said. tears in her eyes, known better than to exist where they didn't think he belonged. Others followed, one after another. Their stories filled the room like thunder. Not just isolated incidents, patterns, proof, pain, and by the end of the night, something else. Hope real, cautious, hard-won hope. Ethan stepped outside into the cool night air afterward, breathing deeply. The stars were out. For the first time in days, he let himself believe they might actually be moving in the right direction. A reporter caught up with him on the sidewalk, recorder already rolling. Director Brooks, she called. "Do you think Savannah is ready for this kind of change?" He thought about it for a second. "No," he said honestly, "no city ever is." The reporter blinked, thrown off by his candor. "But," Ethan added, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "ready or not, it's happening." He walked away before she could ask another question. Back at home, he found an envelope tucked into his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. 2 sentences. "You're doing the right thing. Don't stop. No signature." Ethan stared at the paper for a long moment, then slipped it into his jacket pocket without a word. He knew better than to expect everyone to stand up publicly. But maybe, just maybe, people were finding their courage in their own time, in their own ways. And for now, that was enough. The city wasn't healed yet. Far from it. But for the first time in a long time, it was fighting for its own soul. And Ethan Brooks was leading the way forward, one hard step at a time. Part 9, The Summit. The day of the Town Unity Summit arrived under a bright, cloudless sky. It almost felt symbolic, like the city was trying to wipe itself clean to start over. For weeks, the buildup had been everywhere. Flyers, news stories, word of mouth buzzing through every coffee shop, every church, every school. And now, here they were. Ethan stood backstage, peeking out from behind the heavy curtains at the packed auditorium. Rows and rows of folding chairs stretched out, filled with faces he recognized and faces he didn't. Young and old, black and white, uniformed officers and teenagers in hoodies, teachers, nurses, grandmothers holding hands with grandkids. The whole city had come not just to watch, but to witness, to be part of something bigger than a headline or a soundbite. Clara came up beside him, holding a clipboard but not looking at it. Her eyes were on the crowd too. "You ready?" she asked quietly. Ethan took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything, the anger, the hope, the responsibility settling across his shoulders. "I have to be," he said. When the MC called his name, the room erupted into applause. Real applause. Not polite, not political. Ethan walked to the podium, heart pounding, but his steps steady, confident. He stood there for a moment, just looking out over the sea of faces, and then he began. "When I was a boy," he said, "my mother used to tell me that storms don't just destroy. Sometimes they clear the way." The crowd leaned in, silent, waiting. "And a few months ago, we all went through a storm together," he continued. "A storm of injustice, a storm of anger, a storm of painful truth." He paused, letting it hang there. "But look around you," he said, sweeping a hand over the crowd. "The ground is clearer now. The lies have been stripped away, and what's left is up to us." Scattered nods, quiet murmurs of agreement. "We're building something new here," Ethan said. "Something stronger, fairer, something that belongs to all of us, not just the powerful, not just the privileged, everyone." The applause rose again, louder this time, building until it filled the auditorium. Ethan smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of determination because he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Later, as the summit continued, Ethan sat with community leaders, officers, council members, hammering out real, tangible steps forward. Policies with teeth, timelines with real deadlines, checks and balances written in ink, not in promises. And outside in the hallways and breakout rooms, something even more important was happening. Conversations, hard ones, real ones, officers sitting down with teenagers and hearing their fears. Council members listening to teachers talk about what their students faced walking home every day. Old wounds being exposed to the air, not to fester, but to heal. It wasn't perfect. It was messy. It was awkward, but it was real, and real was enough. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the high windows, Ethan slipped outside for a moment of quiet. He found a bench under an old oak tree, its branches heavy with Spanish moss. The noise of the summit faded to a low, distant hum behind him. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, the weight of the day settling into his bones. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path, and he opened his eyes to see Benson approaching. The young officer looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Ethan watched him come, saying nothing. Benson stopped a few feet away, shifting awkwardly. "I'm not going to take up much of your time," he said, voice rough. "Just needed to say something." Ethan waited. "I froze that night," Benson said, staring down at his shoes. "I knew it was wrong. I knew Mallory was out of line. And I didn't do a damn thing to stop it." He looked up then, meeting Ethan's gaze. "I was scared," he said, "scared of losing my job, scared of speaking up. But that's not an excuse. You deserved better. The city deserved better." Ethan studied him for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Thank you for saying that," Ethan said quietly. "But if you really mean it, don't just say it. Show it." Benson nodded too. A small, tight gesture. "I will," he said. He turned and walked away, shoulders straighter than when he'd arrived. Ethan sat there for a while longer, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. He thought about everything it had taken to get here, the humiliation, the anger, the fight, and he knew it wasn't over. There would be pushback. There would be setbacks. There would be days when progress felt like trying to hold back the ocean with a paper cup. But there would also be days like this, days when hope felt heavier than hate, stronger, more real. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old creased note he had kept from weeks ago. "You're doing the right thing. Don't stop." He smiled to himself, folded the paper back up, and tucked it safely away. He wouldn't stop. Couldn't, because storms didn't just destroy, they cleared the way, and Ethan Brooks was just getting started. He stood, brushed the dust from his jacket, and headed back inside. Back into the noise, the chaos, the work, because the story of Savannah wasn't finished yet, and he wasn't about to let anyone else write it for them. Epilogue. The way forward. In the end, this story reminds us of something powerful, that dignity isn't something granted by a uniform or a title. It's something you carry inside you, even when the world tries to strip it away. Ethan's journey shows that standing up for what's right isn't easy. It's painful, it's lonely, it's slow, but it matters. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. When we hold our leaders accountable, when we demand fairness, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. No matter our age, our background, or where we come from, we all have a role to play in making our communities more just, more compassionate, and more human. Maybe you've seen injustice in your own life. Maybe you faced moments where staying silent seemed easier. But remember, your voice matters, your courage matters, and sometimes the smallest stand can light the way for others. If this story touched you, if it made you think, if it made you hope, we invite you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, no matter how strong the storm, together we can clear the way forward. The changes in Savannah didn't happen in a single season. They unfolded in layers, in moments both dramatic and quiet. 6 months after the arrest, the City Council unanimously approved the most comprehensive police reform package in Georgia's history. A year later, Officer Mallory resigned rather than face a departmental trial. His record now carried a permanent mark that would follow him anywhere he tried to work in law enforcement again. Officer Benson stayed on the force. He transferred to community outreach and began working with youth programs in neighborhoods that had once viewed police only with suspicion. It wasn't redemption, not exactly, but it was a beginning. And Ethan? He continued his work as Director of Public Integrity, expanding the role beyond what anyone had imagined. His office became a beacon for whistleblowers and reform advocates across the state. When his 2-year appointment ended, the governor offered to extend it. Ethan declined. Instead, he founded the Justice Reform Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal support for victims of systemic abuses and training the next generation of public servants. The first class of fellows included the younger brother of that woman who had spoken at the initial town hall, the boy who'd been told he should have known better than to walk where he didn't belong. Sometimes, on rainy nights when the streets of Savannah glisten under the street lamps, Ethan still walks the same route he did that fateful evening. He passes the spot where Mallory's cruiser first pulled up, and he remembers the cold bite of handcuffs, the smirk on an officer's face who thought he held all the power. But he also remembers what came after the city awake and alive with possibility. Ordinary people finding their courage, systems being reimagined rather than merely reformed. And he knows that the most revolutionary act isn't changing laws or policies, though that matters deeply. The most revolutionary act is believing that justice isn't just a distant ideal. It's something we build day by day, choice by choice, voice by voice. The rain still falls in Savannah. Storms still gather, but they don't just destroy. Sometimes they clear the way.